The storm had just started to die down when Officer Caleb Moore turned his cruiser down the old county road that curved along the edge of the ravine. It was the kind of stretch most people forgot even existed. Barely lit, tree branches hanging, low, the kind of place you didn't drive unless you had to. Dispatch had received a vague call from a trucker passing through. Might have seen a dog limping through the ditch. Looked bad. Couldn't stop. Caleb didn't expect much. Half the time, these reports turned out to be nothing. Shadows, deer, or wind-blown trash mistaken for movement. But something about the voice of that caller lingered in his mind. Urgent, a little shaken. So he kept driving. The rain was still falling lightly when he spotted it. A shape slumped near the drainage pipe at the base of the slope, almost entirely swallowed by mud and weeds. Caleb hit the brakes, threw on his hazards, and climbed out, boots immediately sinking into the wet earth as he approached. At first, all he could see was fur, dark, thick, soaked through and caked in muck. Then the shape twitched. It was a German, Shepherd, and he was alive. "Hey, buddy." Caleb's voice softened as he knelt down beside the dog, careful not to startle him. "Easy. I'm here now." The shepherd didn't growl, didn't move. His body was shaking violently from cold, or fear, or both. His hind leg was bent unnaturally, but it wasn't the injury that made Caleb freeze. It was the rope. A thick, frayed piece of cord was knotted tightly around the dog's back leg, and attached to that, barely holding together in the mud, was a small, laminated pouch. Caleb's stomach dropped. He reached out slowly, his hands trembling as he unclipped the pouch from the rope. Inside was a piece of folded paper, sealed in plastic, protected from the rain. His fingers fumbled to open it, heart pounding against his ribs like it was trying to break free. Then he read it, and collapsed to his knees. "If you find him, please, don't leave him. He's all I had. I had no choice. His name is Echo." There was more. A shaky signature, a date, a second note scribbled in the margin. "He will wait for me. Please don't let him die waiting." Caleb couldn't breathe. He looked back at the dog, at Echo, who hadn't stopped watching him with those haunting amber eyes. Eyes that didn't plead, didn't beg, just waited. "Jesus," Caleb muttered, voice breaking as he reached for the radio. "This is Unit 12. I've got a live shepherd. Possible abuse case. Found him with a message tied to his leg. I need backup and a transport team now." Back at the shelter, chaos erupted as the call came through. The vet on duty, Dr. Marissa Hall, dropped everything and prepped the emergency table. Caleb arrived 20 minutes later, soaked to the bone, carrying Echo in both arms. The dog weighed barely 50 pounds, far under what he should have. His ribs showed through his matted coat. One ear was half torn, but he didn't make a sound. Not even when they touched the swollen leg. "What happened to him?" Marissa asked, taking the pouch from Caleb as he gently laid Echo on the table. "He was left," Caleb said, "but not abandoned." He handed her the letter. Marissa read it in silence. When she looked up, her eyes were red. Echo's leg was injured, but not broken, just badly twisted and left untreated. There were old wounds too, some healed, some fresh, signs of long-term neglect, possibly trauma. But again, what startled them most wasn't his condition. It was his behavior. He didn't fight, didn't flinch. Every time a hand touched him, he leaned into it. Every time someone said his name, he blinked slowly, like he remembered what it meant to be called. There was something in him that had already chosen to forgive, before he even knew if he was safe. Marissa stayed with him long after the clinic emptied out that night. She sat beside his crate, watching as he slept fitfully, paws twitching against invisible memories. The note sat beside her, still creased, still damp at the edges. She read it again. "He will wait for me." The next morning, Marissa made a decision. She called a contact at the police station, then a friend at the city's missing persons office. If someone had written that note, if they had loved Echo enough to tie that message to his leg instead of letting him vanish, then they had to be found. But Caleb had already beaten her to it. He had run the name on the letter, first name only, scribbled in the corner, Lucas, then cross-referenced the date with local eviction filings. It took hours, but eventually a connection appeared. A young man, 19, discharged from the foster system the year before. Last known address, the apartment complex 3 blocks from the ditch. Police had been called to the building 3 times in the past month for domestic disturbances. The last report listed Lucas's name. He was gone by the time they got there, but a neighbor had seen him leave, with his dog. They hadn't been back since, and that was the beginning of a search that would uncover a heartbreak no one was ready for, and a bond that would shake the entire city. Because Echo wasn't just a stray, he was the last living proof of a boy who had vanished quietly, and what he had tied to his leg wasn't just a message, it was a lifeline, and Echo had guarded it with his life. The morning after Echo arrived, the shelter opened 2 hours early. Marissa hadn't left. She had pulled an armchair from the break room and dragged it into the clinic, refusing to let Echo spend the night alone in a kennel after what he'd been through. He hadn't moved much, just rested, eyes half open, always watching. Not scared, just tired. Like he was waiting for something that hadn't shown up yet. By the time Officer Caleb returned, Marissa had already fed Echo by hand and cleaned the area around his swollen leg. He wouldn't eat on his own, she said quietly, running a gloved hand over his head. But when I called him by name, he looked at me and started chewing, like he was making sure it was safe. Caleb handed her a thin file. I might have found him. Marissa took the folder and scanned the top page. A photo paper-clipped to the corner showed a thin teenager, maybe 17 or 18 at the time it was taken, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. His name was Lucas Emery. No criminal record, no living family. He'd been in and out of the system since the age of 6, shuffled through a dozen foster homes before being released at 18 with no support, no direction, and no safety net. He had a dog back then? Marissa asked. Picked up Echo, same breed, same markings, as a therapy companion through a pilot outreach program 2 years ago, Caleb said. They were inseparable according to the caseworker's notes, but the funding got cut. Dog care wasn't covered anymore. After that, they vanished off the radar. Marissa's chest tightened. You think he tied that message to Echo because he knew no one would listen otherwise? Caleb nodded. It's the only way he had to leave, a piece of himself behind. They began piecing together the last days leading up to Echo's discovery. Lucas had been evicted a week earlier. According to the apartment manager, there had been complaints, loud arguments, broken furniture, strangers coming and going. The police had shown up once, but no charges were filed. The next morning, Lucas was gone. No forwarding address, no contact number. And Echo had somehow ended up in that ditch. Caleb couldn't let it go. He started canvassing the streets near the apartment, checking alleyways, soup kitchens, even abandoned buildings. Most people hadn't seen anything. But then, a cashier at a 24-hour gas station remembered a boy and a dog coming in during a downpour. The boy was wet, trembling, but bought a can of beans and asked if dogs were allowed in. Didn't talk much, the man said. But he asked me where the nearest animal shelter was. Said he'd heard there was one that didn't put dogs down. Marissa was listening when Caleb told her that. She stood up slowly and looked back at Echo, who had raised his head slightly at the sound of their voices. He was trying to save him, she whispered, not abandon him. That evening, a call came in from a homeless outreach volunteer named Denise. She'd seen the news segment about Echo in the note. She thought she recognized the handwriting. He used to draw all over the margins of my sign-in sheets, she said. Always left little messages for the other guys. Encouraging stuff. I saved a few. Want me to send one over? When the scanned copy came through, Caleb laid it beside the note that had been tied to Echo's leg. The loops were the same, the slant of the L's. Even the way he dotted his I's, slightly off-center, it was him. Lucas had sent Echo ahead of him, with the one hope he had left, that someone out there would see the message and care enough to act. The problem was, no one had seen Lucas since. Caleb filed a formal missing persons report. Posters went up. Local shelters were contacted. Volunteers and officers spread out through the city. Marissa kept Echo close through it all. He'd become restless now, more alert, more vocal, not barking but pacing, as if he knew something was happening and couldn't quite figure out what it was. And then, 3 days later, it happened. A call came in from a bus stop on the east side of town. A man had found a boy curled under the overhang, soaked through, holding a small plastic folder like it was made of gold. He didn't respond when spoken to, just kept repeating, "Did someone find him? Please tell me they found him." Caleb raced to the scene. When he arrived, he recognized him instantly. Lucas looked smaller than the photo, thinner, hollowed out by nights without sleep, days without food. But his eyes, they lit up when Caleb said the name. "Echo, he's safe," Caleb said softly. "He's waiting for you." Lucas didn't speak. He just burst into tears, the kind that shake your whole body, the kind that don't stop. For a long, long time. When they brought him to the shelter, Marissa met them at the door. Echo was already up, pawing at the crate, whining the moment he heard the approaching steps. The second Lucas stepped into the room, Echo lunged forward, not out of panic, but pure, desperate joy. He pressed his body into Lucas's chest, tail thudding against the floor. Lucas dropped to his knees and wrapped his arms around him, sobbing. Into his fur. "I'm sorry," Lucas whispered again and again. "I didn't know what else to do. I thought someone would find you. I thought you'd be okay." Echo didn't move, didn't let go, because he had been okay. He had waited. And now, everything he had protected, the note, the story, the last, fragile thread of hope, had finally led them back to each other. The reunion left the shelter staff speechless. Most of them had seen their share of heartbreak, abandonment, and bittersweet goodbyes. But watching Lucas fall to the floor, sobbing into Echo's thick coat while the dog whimpered softly and curled tighter around him, it was something else. Entirely. No one moved. Even the other animals fell strangely silent, as if they too understood that something sacred was happening. Marissa stood at the edge of the clinic doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth. She had been prepared for tears. What she hadn't expected was the way Echo transformed. Just hours ago, he was lethargic and silent, clinging to sleep and barely touching his food. But now, his tail thumped wildly, his body vibrating with joy, his eyes alive again. He wasn't just happy, he was whole. Lucas didn't let go for a long time, and when he finally did, it wasn't to stand or wipe his face. It was to place his forehead gently against Echo's and whisper something no one could hear. It was Caleb who finally broke the silence. "You didn't just tie a note to his leg. Kid, you tied your life to it." Lucas nodded, voice cracking. "He was all I had. I figured if I didn't make it, someone had to know he mattered." Ethan, the shelter director, pulled up a chair beside him. "You did matter, and so did he." That message changed everything. The hours that followed were filled with quiet questions. Lucas was dehydrated and exhausted, but coherent. He'd been on the street for days after the eviction, sleeping behind dumpsters, skipping meals to feed Echo. When things became too dangerous, when he feared they'd both be hurt by the people squatting in the building, he'd made a choice. He'd found the laminated pouch he used to keep his art in, wrote the only thing he could think of, and tied it to Echo's leg, hoping that if anyone found him, they'd see the dog was loved. Then he let him go. "I followed him at a distance. For 2 blocks, Lucas said. But when I saw a patrol car slow down, I ran." Marissa reached for his hand gently. "That was the bravest thing you could have done." He shook his head. "It didn't feel brave. It felt like giving up." "Sometimes," Caleb said from behind her, "survival looks like giving up. But you didn't. You survived." And so, did he. They kept Lucas under observation at the shelter for a few nights, arranging for temporary housing through a youth outreach program connected to the department. Echo never left his side. Even at night, when Lucas slept on a cot in the staff room, Echo would curl tightly against his back, ears twitching at every creak or shuffle. But something began to shift as word spread. The media had caught wind of the story through an anonymous tip. Soon, the shelter was overwhelmed. Reporters at the door, camera crews asking for interviews. Everyone wanted a piece of the dog with the message, the boy who loved his dog more than his own safety. Ethan shut most of it down. "This isn't a headline," he told one outlet. "It's a healing." Still, people wanted to help. Donations poured in, offers for permanent housing, therapy, college sponsorships. Marissa watched the transformation with cautious hope. After all, the world could be fickle with its attention. But for now, she allowed herself to believe that something permanent was growing. It was Lucas who surprised them the most. One morning, just a week after he had returned to Echo's side, he asked if he could volunteer. "At the front desk," he said shyly. "Or, the kennels. I don't mind cleaning. I don't want to leave yet." He didn't have to ask twice. Soon, he was helping with feedings, cleaning crates, walking nervous strays, always with Echo at his side. The other animals responded to him in a way none of them expected. Even the most anxious rescues, the ones who refused to be touched, would inch toward him after a few moments. It wasn't just that he was calm, it was that he understood them. One afternoon, Marissa found him sitting quietly in the isolation room. A new intake, a shepherd mix named Rudy, had been found chained to a post in the rain. He hadn't let anyone near him in hours. But there Lucas sat, cross-legged in the corner, not touching, not speaking, just breathing in sync with him. After 10 minutes, Rudy stood up, walked across the room, and placed his head in Lucas's lap. "You have a gift," Marissa said quietly as she stood at the door. Lucas didn't look up. "I think I just speak the same language." As the days turned into weeks, something remarkable began to happen. Echo no longer looked fragile. His coat thickened, his muscles returned. He ran now, really ran, not just limped across the garden, but full-out galloped like the wind had been waiting to carry him all along. And Lucas, though still quiet, no longer looked like someone trying to disappear. He stood straighter. He laughed sometimes. He even started sketching again. First just lines, then small portraits. One day, he left one on the bulletin board. It was Echo, curled up with a piece of paper in his mouth, and beneath it, a message. This time, we both got rescued. No one touched the drawing. No one dared take it down, because in a world that often throws people away, Lucas had sent his hope out tied to a dog's leg, and that hope had come back, not just alive, but leading the way to something bigger, a second chance. For both of them, the shelter was never short on stories. Every animal brought with it a past, a history etched in scars, in silence, in eyes that watched the door long after it closed. But Lucas and Echo had become more than just a story. They were a living reminder of what it meant to endure. And the shelter had grown quiet around them in the best way, like the walls were learning to breathe easier. Still, beneath the peace, a question lingered. What now? Lucas had settled into a rhythm. He arrived early each morning, always with Echo trotting at his side, and together they handled the morning feeding routine before volunteers arrived. He never asked for anything, never complained. He worked with a quiet focus that felt almost sacred. But one evening, as the last of the lights dimmed, and Marissa passed through the hallway to lock up, she found him sitting alone by the kennel window, with Echo's head in his lap. She didn't speak right away, just watched as his fingers moved slowly over the dog's ears, as if trying to memorize every line of his companion's face. "He waited for me," Lucas said softly, "even when I didn't deserve it." "You never stopped deserving it," Marissa replied. "You just stopped believing anyone could see it." He turned to her, his voice barely audible. "What if I can't give him what he really needs? What if I mess this up all over again?" "You gave him the only thing that ever mattered," she said. "You came back." That night, she found a letter folded and tucked into her office. Door. No envelope. No name. Just one line on the front. "If he still wants me, maybe someone else will too." Inside was Lucas's handwritten account of everything. From the day he picked up Echo at the shelter's outreach booth 2 years earlier, to the night he tied the pouch around his leg and whispered, "Find someone better than me." It was raw, honest, filled with pain and love and shame, but also redemption. He wrote about how Echo never once turned his back, even when they had nothing, even when Lucas tried to sleep standing up because he was too scared to lie down on the streets, and how, when everything else disappeared, it was Echo's eyes that kept him from fading. The letter ended with a question. "Do you think someone would hire a kid like me? One who didn't give up even when it hurt to try?" Marissa brought it straight to Ethan the next morning. They read it in silence. Then, without hesitation, Ethan walked to the staff board, took down the old volunteer rotation chart, and replaced it with a new one. At the bottom, beneath the staff names, was a freshly laminated badge, Lucas Emery, Probationary Kennel Tech. They offered him a position that day, not out of pity, but because he had already been doing the job better than most ever could. Lucas didn't cry when they told him, but Echo did. He let out a sharp, excited bark the moment Lucas read the title out loud, then spun in a tight circle and pressed his head into his legs like he understood everything. And maybe he did, because for the first time, Lucas wasn't surviving. For Echo, he was living with him. With the stability came healing. Lucas was connected to a therapist through the shelter's donor-funded support program. He began classes online at night, mostly animal sciences, but a few art electives too. He kept sketching, always in the margins of notebooks, napkins, even the back of kennel feeding logs. One of his drawings, a quiet rendering of a leash draped over an empty crate with a folded message beneath it, ended up in a local art exhibit sponsored by the city's Outreach Council. The exhibit went viral for a different reason. A woman named Claire saw the piece in a local news article. She worked for a foundation that provided scholarships to at-risk youth who demonstrated resilience and advocacy through personal experience. She'd read about Echo months earlier, but hadn't connected the dots until she saw the drawing. She called Marissa the next day. By the end of the week, Lucas had been nominated for a full-ride grant to pursue veterinary technician training. Not just classes, but an apprenticeship. Paid, flexible. With Echo officially cleared as an emotional support animal, the news hit him like a tidal wave. He didn't celebrate loudly, didn't jump or scream. He just knelt beside Echo, hugged him tightly, and said, "We're going to help other dogs now just like you helped me." It was Echo who barked in response. The following Saturday, the shelter held its annual adoption fair, an event normally filled with music, balloons, and the frantic energy of wagging tails and hopeful families. But this year, something different happened. Toward the end of the day, Marissa stood on the small stage set up near the clinic and asked everyone to gather near. She told the story, not the viral one, not the polished one, but the real one, about a boy who had lost everything except his dog, and a dog who waited in a ditch with a note tied to his leg because love refused to leave quietly. She spoke about what it meant to choose hope when there's no reason to, and how the bond between one boy and one dog had quietly changed the way they all looked at rescue, not just as something shelters did, but something hearts did when they had no other choice. Then she called Lucas up to the stage. He stood there, awkwardly, hands in his pockets, while Echo sat at his side, chest high, tail wagging like a flag in the wind. Marissa placed a small medal around Echo's neck. It read, "Service, Loyalty, Light." And as the crowd clapped, Lucas finally smiled, not the hesitant, shy half-smile they were used to, but a full, undeniable one, because in that moment, he understood. The note he'd tied to Echo's leg hadn't just saved a dog, it had carried him back to himself. The shelter was quiet the morning after the adoption fair, but not in the way it had been before Echo arrived. It was a settled kind of quiet, warm, still, full of a peace that only follows after something has come full circle. The ribbons and signs from the event still hung above the front desk, faded slightly by the sun that had poured through the glass that afternoon. On the clinic door, a photo had been taped overnight. A candid shot of Echo, seated tall beside Lucas on the fair stage, both of them squinting slightly in the sun, both looking ahead. Lucas stood in front of it that morning longer than he realized. He hadn't slept much, not out of restlessness, but something else entirely. Contentment. He didn't feel the need to run anymore. For the first time in his life, his past didn't scare him, and the future didn't feel like a fog. He reached up, gently straightening the corners of the photo, and smiled. Behind him, Echo padded over, stretching his legs before sitting down with a low huff, like he was reminding Lucas he was still there, always had been, and always would be. Lucas chuckled softly. "You want breakfast, don't you?" Echo wagged his tail once, a slow, deliberate motion that said, "You first." They had developed a quiet routine in the weeks since the fair. Lucas now worked full-time at the shelter, enrolled in online veterinary tech classes during the evenings. He had even been invited to speak at 2 youth events, something that once would have made him panic. But standing in front of others, especially kids who reminded him of who he used to be, was different now. He didn't see pity in their eyes. He saw recognition. And when he told them about Echo, about the ditch, about the letter, and the hope he'd barely clung to, their eyes didn't widen because the story was sad. They widened because it was true. People asked him what it felt like to be a success story. He never quite knew how to answer, because the truth was, success didn't feel like a finish line. It felt like waking up. It felt like warm food and a safe place to sleep. It felt like watching Echo chase falling leaves in the shelter yard, finally free from the weight he'd carried so long. It felt like being seen, not as a case, not as a headline, but as a whole person. One afternoon, a woman came in with a frightened husky mix she'd found by the train station. The dog was limping and wouldn't let anyone near him. Lucas approached slowly, as he always did. No sudden movements, no reaching. He crouched beside the trembling dog and simply sat. After a while, he began to speak, not loudly, not for anyone else's ears, just a soft, steady voice, telling the dog that he was safe now, that he didn't have to run, that someone had found him, and that was enough. Eventually, the dog leaned into him. The woman cried, and when she asked how Lucas had learned to do that, he said only, "Someone did it for me first." That night, after the shelter closed, Marissa and Caleb joined Lucas by Echo's resting spot under the old elm in the courtyard. They sat in the grass, watching the orange sky fade into lavender. There wasn't much to say. They didn't need to fill the space. But eventually, Caleb cleared his throat. You know, when I found him that day, I almost missed him. One more curve in the road and I would have been past. Lucas looked down at Echo, who was sprawled beside him, head in his lap, eyes half closed in peace. But you didn't, he said softly. You stopped. That was the first good thing. Caleb nodded. I've made plenty of traffic stops. I've never made one that mattered more. Marissa smiled without looking away from the sky. It's funny. We thought the message on Echo's leg was meant for us. A warning, a plea, but maybe it wasn't. Lucas looked over. She continued. Maybe it was meant for him. Maybe it was never really about us finding him. It was about him carrying that message long enough for you to find your way back. Lucas was quiet for a long time after that. When he finally spoke, his voice caught in his throat. I told him, before I let him go, find someone who sees what I see in you. Echo shifted gently, pressing his head closer to Lucas's chest. And he did, Lucas whispered. He found me again. The following week, Lucas mailed something he'd held onto for too long, a copy of the original letter he'd tied to Echo's leg. He addressed it not to a newspaper or a rescue agency, but to a youth support nonprofit he'd once been turned away from. He didn't send it out of anger. He sent it with a note of his own attached. This saved a life. Maybe it can help save another. If you ever doubt whether these kids can love, fight, survive, remember that one boy with a dog who never stopped believing they were worth it. The organization reached back with an invitation. Lucas would speak at their annual gala. By then, Echo had his own honorary tag, polished brass engraved with the words, Hope Delivered. He wore it everywhere, not because he needed a medal, but because he had carried something no one else could have. And in the end, the note tied to his leg had done more than deliver a message. It had written a future, one made of second chances, quiet faith.